At 2 o'clock in the morning, Annie stood at the entrance of Ethan's apartment, the key in her hand unable to be inserted into the lock. She hesitated for a few seconds but ultimately pressed the doorbell. The door opened. The individual who opened it was not Ethan, it was his female assistant, clad in a nightgown, her long hair disheveled, her gaze both cautious and suggestive. "Who are you?" she inquired. In an instant, Annie's mind was overwhelmed with turmoil. Her throat constricted as she forced out the words, "I am his girlfriend." The assistant's face briefly stiffened before she smiled nonchalantly and said, "Then I'm afraid you've arrived too late." This statement struck Annie's heart like a piercing blade. Annie was about to speak when the hallway lights abruptly illuminated, and Ethan ascended from downstairs, still in his suit, carrying a takeout bag, his face marked by exhaustion. Upon seeing her, he frowned and asked, "What are you doing here?" Annie fixed her gaze on him intently and questioned, "What is your relationship with her?" Ethan's eyes shifted to the assistant behind her, his frown deepening. "It's merely a professional relationship, don't make unreasonable accusations," he replied. "She's opening your door in a nightgown, and you claim it's professional?" Her voice trembled as she continued, "Ethan, aren't you exhausted from deceiving me?" A trace of impatience surfaced in Ethan's eyes as he said, "Annie, I'm genuinely fatigued today, please don't cause a scene." "Are you serious?" "I came to discuss marriage with you, only to find you cohabiting with your assistant," she retorted. Ethan let out a cold laugh. "Discuss marriage? Do you think I have the capacity for that now?" Annie was momentarily stunned, her fingertips growing cold, and asked, "So you never intended to marry me, did you?" He offered no response, merely murmuring, "I have an early meeting tomorrow, don't argue here." Annie gave a bitter smile, though no tears fell. She finally realized that this 3-year relationship was, in his view, nothing more than a dispensable diversion. She turned to leave, her steps unsteady, and as the elevator doors slowly closed, the mirror reflected her pale countenance. 3 days later, Annie received a message from Ethan, "Let us take some time to cool off." She stared at her phone, her fingers gradually clenching. Cooling off, did this signify a breakup? She intended to respond but found herself unable to type a single word. Her phone chimed again with a new message, "The assistant has resigned, you need not overthink it." No need to overthink? The events of that day remained vividly etched in her mind every second. Annie did not reply and instead promptly blocked his number. She picked up the car keys from the table and began packing her belongings, clearing out the apartment. With this departure, she resolved not to look back. 1 month later, Annie had changed jobs, cut her hair short, switched phone numbers, and even cleared her Facebook account. Her new life, though somewhat disordered, was at least untainted. She believed she had completely severed this relationship until, at a meeting, Ethan appeared before her. "This is the representative of our new partner, Ethan," the host announced. During the host's introduction, she caught sight of his familiar yet aloof profile. Ethan also noticed her, his gaze heavy as falling snow, oppressively so. After the meeting adjourned, he pursued her, "Annie, have you truly eradicated me from your life so completely?" Raising her head to meet his eyes, she replied, "What else? Keep you around to hinder me further?" Ethan was momentarily speechless. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, "Ethan, from the day I stood at your door, we were already finished." She turned and departed decisively. Unbeknownst to her, he stood behind, his fingers slowly clenching, his eyes brimming with suppressed emotion. He muttered under his breath, "If you wish to escape, I won't let you." That evening, upon returning home, Annie opened her email and was confronted by an anonymous message bearing the subject line, "Did you think he betrayed you only once?" Attached were several photographs depicting Ethan and another woman intimately seated in a car, dated to a time when she and Ethan were still deeply in love. Annie stared at the images, her fingers momentarily unable to hold the mouse steady. A sharp pain gripped her chest, as though the wound from that night had been torn open anew, yet this time, she shed no tears. She merely smiled calmly before clicking delete. She understood that in this relationship, she had not only lost but had also forfeited her dignity. "Ethan, if one day you wish to reclaim me, go ahead and see how much weight you still hold in my heart. 3 days after receiving the anonymous email, Annie resigned from her recently joined company. She was weary not of work, but of everything associated with the name Ethan, which now repulsed her. She wished to avoid encountering him in any setting, even in passing. Yet, unbeknownst to her, the more thoroughly she distanced herself, the more urgently Ethan pursued her. She's resigned? Ethan stared at the resignation letter sent by HR, his brows tightly furrowed. What did she say? His voice was icy. Miss Annie said only one thing, the assistant replied softly. She said, no need to contact me in the future. Ethan slammed the document onto the table. His pride accustomed him to controlling everything, yet he could not prevent her departure. He had always assumed that a single word from him would bring her back. She had loved him so deeply. Since their university days, Annie had pursued him for 3 years, undeterred by his coldness. But this time, she seemed to have truly vanished, leaving not a trace behind. Ethan suddenly recalled the sight of her turning away that day, her expression so calm it seemed unlike her, as if she had given up entirely. How could she dare? He pressed his brow firmly. Find out where she lives now and which company she's with, he gritted out, spare no expense. But Miss Annie deliberately altered all her information, used headquarters resources to track her down. For the first time, Ethan lost control over a woman. He was unaware that the woman he once easily placated had now become someone he could not reach, despite all his efforts. 1 week later, Annie sat in an independent design studio, sketching the cover draft for the next season's fashion publication. She received a call from an unfamiliar number, assuming it was a client, only to hear a deep, familiar voice, Annie. The pen in her hand snapped with a crack. How did you obtain this number? She demanded. Did you think changing jobs and numbers would make you disappear from my sight? She sneered. Ethan, are you here to flaunt your control? I'm here to see you, he replied with his usual firmness, now. Ethan, we no longer have any connection. You may not love me, but don't flee. She paused for 2 seconds before hanging up. She had no time to waste on this fruitless relationship. Unbeknownst to her, Ethan had indeed arrived. At 5 in the afternoon, as she emerged from the studio building, she spotted the familiar black Maybach parked by the roadside. The door opened, and he stepped out in a suit, his gaze fixed heavily upon her. Annie. She turned to leave. He quickly stepped forward, grasping her wrist. Do you hate me this much? You're not worthy of asking that question. Nothing happened between me and the assistant, he attempted to explain. She was just staying over that night. You don't need to explain, she replied coldly, withdrawing her hand. We're already over. Ethan gazed into her frigid eyes, his chest feeling as though pierced by a nail. You weren't like this before. Nor were you like this back then. She said nothing more, walking past him directly. Ethan did not pursue her. He stood in place, watching her receding figure, a single thought echoing in his mind, she truly won't return. At 11 that night, Ethan sat in an empty office, contracts spread before him, yet he had not turned a single page. His assistant stood at the door, hesitant to knock. He opened an entire bottle of whiskey, a faint flush of intoxication on his face. He never drank. Annie had once remarked that men who drink only make mistakes. But now, he wanted to be drunk. Perhaps inebriation could erase the coldness in her eyes when she looked at him. He pulled out his phone and opened Annie's Instagram. She had blocked him. Yet he kept staring at the last few undeleted messages. Annie, let's calm down for a bit. The assistant has resigned, you don't need to overthink it. He had once believed he was right. But now, it seemed every step he took had only pushed her further away. Ethan closed his eyes, memories flooding his mind, her jogging behind him, her cautious anticipation of his arrival at her birthday, her first time crying in his arms, voice trembling as she asked, have you ever truly loved me? He hadn't answered then. Now, he wanted to, but she was no longer listening. The next day, Annie received a bouquet, its familiar wrapping containing her favorite daisies. Without a glance, she tossed it into the trash. The card read, "Stop running." She let out a cold laugh and returned to her workstation. Barely seated, her roommate burst in from outside, gossip brimming on her face. "Annie, someone's waiting for you downstairs." Super handsome, in a suit, the whole building's buzzing. Annie didn't even look up. "It's got nothing to do with me. He said if you don't go down, he won't leave. Then he can wait forever." Her roommate was stunned. "Your ex? You're practically grinding his heart to dust." Annie remained silent. She lowered her head to continue her sketches, as if the outside world held no relevance. Yet her fingers trembled slightly. She knew Ethan wouldn't give up easily. But she also knew that this time, she wouldn't let him succeed so easily. What he owed her far exceeded a mere sorry. Annie's calm lasted less than 3 days. The studio abruptly informed her that the main exhibition resources for next month's fashion show had been withdrawn. Bewildered, she asked, "Wasn't this already confirmed?" "The person in charge told me directly, and the contract was verified. They changed their stance at the last minute, saying the resources are going to another company." "Which company?" The assistant handed her a document, and she immediately recognized the familiar name, Xinyao Media, a subsidiary of the Lin Corporation, a venture Ethan had personally built from the ground up. Annie's expression darkened instantly. She finally understood why, after seeing Ethan last week, this series of changes had followed in rapid succession. He was no longer merely appearing in her life, he was tearing through the boundaries of her new existence, barging in directly. She didn't lose her temper but closed the meeting room door and sat alone for a full 2 hours. The sunlight outside was blinding, yet she felt as though she had fallen into shadow. For the past 3 years, she had tread carefully by his side, yielding step by step, only to preserve their relationship from breaking. But now, he wouldn't even grant her the space to breathe alone. "You cancelled her collaboration?" Ethan sat in the boardroom office, listening to the assistant's report over the phone, his expression eerily calm. "She needs to realize she can't accomplish much on her own. Doing this will make her hate you more." "Hatred is preferable to indifference," he said lightly, his tone as cold as an ice blade. "She's too adept at escaping," he said, pressing his brow, his voice hoarse. "I must force her to turn back. But once she knows it's you, she will know." Ethan stood and approached the floor-to-ceiling window. Gazing at the bustling traffic below, his eyes narrowed incrementally. "I want her to understand that without me, she has nothing." 3 days later, Annie secured a new exhibition platform, only for the organizer to abruptly withdraw it, citing the same reason, resource reallocation. This time, she didn't bother asking who was responsible. She knew Ethan no longer intended to leave her any leeway. He was well aware of her stubbornness, he was simply using the cruelest means to force her submission. She could refuse to love him, but she couldn't afford not to survive. Annie opened her contacts, her finger hovering over the long-blocked number without moving. She refused to concede defeat, yet she had to confront reality. Ethan was no longer someone she could evade. At 10 that night, Annie finally made the call. She didn't speak, but the call was answered. After a brief silence, a familiar yet long-absent voice emerged. "Have you finally remembered me?" Annie clutched her phone tightly, her voice frigid. "You've won." Ethan chuckled lightly, as if he had anticipated it. "Meet me." "No, you no longer have the right to refuse me." The words escaped him, startling even himself for a moment. He wouldn't have spoken this way before. But now, all his rationality had been gradually incinerated by her repeated indifference. Annie took a deep breath. "Ethan, do you know what's most repulsive about you? It's that you claim to love me yet refuse to grant me even the slightest respect." He remained silent. Her voice was steady, yet laden with suppressed pain. "You can choose not to love me, you can betray me, but you have no right to destroy me. Whether I live well or not is never for you to judge." She hung up immediately after. Ethan stood in the empty villa living room, staring at the disconnected call screen, his face grim. As the assistant entered with documents, he waved them off. "Leave me." Once alone, he slammed his fist against the table's edge. His knuckles whitened, as if releasing long-suppressed anger. He had been waiting for her to return on her own. Yet not only did she not return, she retreated step by step, methodically erasing every memory between them. She was truly intent on severing the past. At midnight, Annie leaned back in a chair on the balcony, her phone screen still displaying the call log. She hadn't slept and couldn't. His presence from recent days filled her vision. She despised his control, his arrogance, and his claim that she could do nothing alone. But she hated herself more. Why, even now, did her heart still tremble slightly at his voice? After much thought, she posted an update on Facebook, "Even if abandoned by all, I will not turn back." She deleted the framed photo he had given her, which once held the only image of him smiling at her on his birthday. From now on, she resolved to bury the past in the deepest soil, never to unearth it again. "Ethan, this time, it's not a tantrum, I've truly given up." That night, Ethan, uncharacteristically, suffered insomnia. At 32, he prided himself on his calm and rational emotional control. Yet Annie's words, "Even if abandoned by all, I will not turn back," lodged in his chest like a thorn he couldn't remove. He couldn't fathom how she could be so resolute. Initially, it was she who pursued him relentlessly, who endured time and again, who offered her heart to him. But now, she seemed an entirely different person, unwilling to offer even a single soft word. He picked up his phone, repeatedly opening her Facebook. The post had been deleted, but he had saved a screenshot. For the first time, Ethan realized he not only regretted but also felt a tinge of fear. He feared she might truly leave for good. He feared that after exhausting all his tactics, he wouldn't win her back but would instead face the final wall she erected herself. The next day, he uncharacteristically cancelled an important financial meeting. His assistant cautioned, "Ethan, this collaboration, you signed it yourself." "Postpone it," he replied flatly. "Say I have a sudden personal matter." "Personal?" He cast a faint glance, and the assistant fell silent. At noon, as Annie stepped out to grab coffee, a familiar black Maybach pulled up steadily before her. The window rolled down, and Ethan, with an expression brooking no refusal, said, "Get in." She hesitated, stepping back. "No need." "I'm not here to force you," he said softly. "I want to talk." She stared at him for a few seconds before ultimately opening the door and getting in. The car's interior was, as always, cold and oppressively silent. "What do you want to discuss?" "The studio matter, it was my doing," he began. Annie froze, turning to him. "Do you realize that your admission right now is more repulsive than any denial you've ever made?" "I didn't intend to ruin you." "You did," she sneered. "You knew what you were doing, you just didn't care how much it would cost me." Ethan fell silent for a moment before his tone softened. "I was afraid you'd leave me." The words landed heavily in the air. Annie was briefly stunned. She hadn't expected such directness. "So you blocked my every escape, severed my work bit by bit, and forced me back to you?" "I wanted you to know you're not alone." He paused. "You have me." "You're not someone by my side," she stared at him. "You're the source I want to escape." Ethan took a deep breath, as if finally reining in his emotions. "Annie, I shouldn't have brushed you off that day at my door, nor let you misunderstand me and her, nor should you have let those photos be real." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He wanted to explain that the photos stemmed from a drunken lapse. They were in a Cold War then, she hadn't answered his calls for 3 days, and in his inebriation, someone had put him in that car, with paparazzi hired by the other party snapping the shots. But he didn't explain, not because he couldn't, but because he knew she wouldn't believe him. She had long since stopped being willing to listen. Seeing his silence, a faint weariness surfaced in Annie's heart. In this game, she wasn't unscathed, she was simply too stubborn to show it. She turned her head to the window, her voice low. "Ethan, we're no longer who we once were. Everything you've done isn't love, it's control, it's harm. You say you fear my leaving, but you've never considered from my perspective why I'd want to leave you." The car was so quiet that only the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard. Ethan remained still for a while before reaching to the back seat, retrieving a black velvet box, and gently sliding it toward her. Annie was taken aback. "What's this?" His voice was low and steady. "I prepared it long ago." Her fingers lingered on the box for a few seconds before she opened it. Inside was an engagement ring 6-prong setting, sizable carat, in the vintage Tiffany curve style she had once casually mentioned liking. A fleeting daze flickered in her eyes. "How long have you had this?" 2 months. "Then why have I never seen it?" "I planned to propose formally after the project concluded." "And the result?" "The result was you saw my assistant at my place." Annie fell silent for a few seconds before letting out a soft laugh, tinged with irony. "Ethan, it's not that you don't love me. It's just that you always place me first after your need to control. You do love me, but your love is too selfish." She pushed the ring box back to him. Too late. She opened the door, stepped out, and didn't look back. Ethan remained in the car, emotion swirling in his eyes. He didn't get out, only raised his hand to grip the box tightly, as if what she returned wasn't just a ring but his final shred of hope. That night, Annie dreamed of 3 years prior. When they had just started dating, she twisted her ankle, and he carried her home on his back for 3 kilometers. She asked him, "Ethan, do you care a lot about how others see you?" He replied faintly, "I don't care only about how you see me." She smiled, "Then you'd better never lie to me." He nodded. But now, everything had changed. Upon waking, she found she had cried. She stared at the ceiling in silence for a long time. "Ethan, do you think your current tenderness can offset your past coldness? If so, you're too naive." Annie never imagined she'd once again stand at a precipice with no retreat. This time, it wasn't due to Ethan but a sudden brand rights controversy. She had collaborated with a light luxury brand on a design, and just as the samples launched, accusations of plagiarizing a niche foreign designer's work erupted, igniting social media. The partner immediately distanced themselves from her, thrusting her studio into the spotlight. Even a recently secured magazine shoot was abruptly cancelled, and nearly overnight, the entire industry severed ties with her. Annie had never plagiarized. The design in question was a sketch she completed a year prior, merely unpublicized. She didn't fear investigation, she feared destruction. Once public opinion escalated, the truth would be buried. She knew this industry was too pragmatic. No one would vouch for a designer who was merely potentially innocent. The studio was in chaos. Her assistant rushed in, sobbing, "Annie, the platform has pulled all our products." She remained composed. "Have we sent the PR plan?" "Yes, but no one's responded." She asked no further. From PR to public sentiment, from response to counterattack, she could handle it all, but she knew even the strongest individual couldn't withstand a coordinated assault. She couldn't understand why that foreign designer singled her out at this critical juncture. Even less comprehensible was why this wave of public opinion seemed like a premeditated hunt. As she prepared for a meeting, her private phone rang, displaying Ethan's familiar number. She hesitated for 2 seconds before answering. "Are you okay?" His voice was low, lacking its usual firmness, tinged with caution. "How do you know?" she asked. "News of your situation has spread through the entire circle." He paused. "I can help you." "I don't need your help." Her voice was cold. "Annie, don't be stubborn." He quickened his pace. "This is orchestrated hype. You can't handle it alone." Her heart jolted. "You've investigated?" "Yes." She fell silent. Ethan continued, "The culprits are a PR firm within the industry, paid by a rival to frame you as the disadvantaged party. They aim to utterly discredit you." Annie closed her eyes, her fingers trembling slightly. As she suspected, this was indeed a deliberate sniper attack. "Why tell me?" she asked softly. "Because you're someone I want to protect." Silence stretched between them. After a long pause, she asked, "How can you help?" "Give me 1 day, and I'll make them issue a public apology." "At what cost?" "You know I won't help for free." She smiled bitterly, you haven't changed. Nor have you, his tone softened further. As long as you're willing, I can give you anything including the explanation I've always owed you. The following afternoon, the foreign designer's official account issued a statement declaring the plagiarism incident a misunderstanding, affirming the clarity of Annie's design copyright, with the collaborating brand offering an apology. With that statement, public opinion reversed instantly. Several authoritative fashion platforms published articles vindicating originality, and comment sections gradually shifted. But she knew this wasn't a triumph of truth, it was Ethan's intervention. Indeed, that afternoon, he appeared at her studio's entrance. She initially had no intention of seeing him, but a colleague exclaimed, "Wow, your ex is like a TV drama CEO, now the whole company knows your boyfriend is Ethan." She didn't clarify, nor could she. She only knew that if she didn't go downstairs today, Ethan would position himself where no one could ignore him. So she went down. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his figure tall and composed, his gaze softening slightly upon seeing her. "Are you here to mock me?" Her voice was devoid of emotion. "I'm here to fulfill a promise," he said, handing her a document. She opened it, an invitation from an international fashion foundation, appointing her as the annual Young Design Mentor for the Paris Autumn Show. She glanced at the letterhead, instantly grasping its significance. "What do you want me to trade this for?" Ethan didn't respond, just stared at her. After a few seconds, she spoke coldly, "Ethan, why do you always think I can't do without you?" He replied softly, "It's not that you can't do without me, it's that I don't want you to struggle so much. But you'll never understand that I'd rather shatter than take the ladder you offer." She handed the document back, "Thank you, but I don't need it." He didn't take it, instead saying deliberately, "Annie, even if you don't accept me now, one day you'll realize I'm not your enemy. You loved me so deeply for so long, I don't believe there's truly nothing left in your heart." His words were soft, yet they struck her heart like a pebble, rippling outward. That evening, Annie walked home alone. On her phone was a scanned copy of the foundation's invitation she had ultimately asked a colleague to keep a draft. She wasn't sure if she was wavering. She only knew that her relentless push forward these years wasn't to show Ethan she was doing well, but to prove she could live beautifully without him. Yet today, she had to admit, without his intervention, she might not have survived this. It was a truth she was loath to accept. She had always been proud, but now she had to bow to the powerlessness of reality. The wind tousled her hair as she stood at the corner, her gaze cold. "Ethan," she murmured, "where exactly do you want to drag me back to?" Annie hadn't expected this city's breeze to carry a faintly familiar scent. She signed the Paris invitation not out of compromise, but because she knew some battles must be won decisively. Despite past humiliations, she would now step onto that runway, showing everyone, she was no one's appendage. She could stand in the spotlight on her own. Unbeknownst to her, the moment she signed the invitation, Ethan's world began to crumble. The Lynn Corporation faced an anonymous short-selling attack, with stocks of 2 subsidiaries plummeting, sparking public uproar. Almost overnight, the boardroom grew turbulent, executive meetings intensified, and investors withdrew en masse. The media began questioning whether he could retain his position as president. Yet amid this maelstrom, Ethan didn't immediately address the media but instead made a call, arrange a meeting with Annie. The assistant hesitated. "Ethan, now isn't the time for emotions." "I'm not discussing emotions," his voice was low. "I need her." That need her wasn't emotional, it was pragmatic. Annie held a multinational collaboration resource, precisely the critical financing link in the Lynn Corporation's restructuring plan. She was the only one who could complete this segment. Annie encountered Ethan at a fashion tasting event. She hadn't expected him to attend, he typically disdained such public networking charades. He approached her, and those around instinctively stepped back. Annie didn't move. He stopped before her, his voice low and steady. "I have something to discuss with you." She glanced at him, replying faintly, "You're quite busy now, aren't you?" "For matters concerning you, I'm never busy." Her lips twitched slightly, as if hearing a joke. Ethan, I don't believe you're saying this to confess. Ignoring her quip, he handed her a collaboration document. That Paris design resource you hold, I'd like to integrate it into Lynn's asset consolidation strategy. Name your price. Annie took the file, glanced at it, and laughed. You're here to negotiate business with me? You won't see me otherwise, so I had to try another approach. So you're using me as a tool? I'm treating you as hope. For the first time, he bowed his head before her, not out of humility, but an acknowledgement of her worth. Annie gazed at him quietly before speaking after a pause. Have you ever imagined you'd fall into distress? He didn't respond. She pressed on, you once said I'd be nothing without you. And now? You need me to secure your position. Ethan looked at her, a layer of complex emotion in his eyes. I was wrong, Annie. You're far stronger than I imagined. Unfortunately, you've realized it too late. Annie closed the file. We can discuss collaboration, but I have conditions. He paused, name them. She enunciated clearly, from today, you must not interfere in my life, investigate me, touch those around me, or force me back. You can have this resource, but you must learn to respect me. Ethan stared at her for a long while before nodding. Agreed. 3 days after signing the agreement, the Lynn Corporation issued a public statement announcing a deep strategic partnership with international independent designer Annie. Public perception began to shift, stock prices stabilized and rose, temporarily alleviating Ethan's crisis. He had hoped this would mark a turning point for reconciliation. But that afternoon, he received a call from an unknown number. Ethan, it's Tony. I know I'm an old acquaintance of Annie's, just a heads up, your current girlfriend has been spreading word outside that you're getting engaged by year's end. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Who? That female investor on your project, Kitty. I never mentioned an engagement. You didn't, but she did. You know Annie's temper once this spreads, she'll surely. Ethan hung up immediately and rushed to the studio. But by the time he arrived, Annie was gone. On her desk lay the collaboration file, its stamped page torn out, with a note pressed beside it, written with forceful strokes, no need to meet again. His fingers trembled slightly. Annie, he muttered through gritted teeth, a storm brewing in his eyes. That night, Annie sat alone on a riverside bench. The wind was strong, and though she wore no coat, she didn't feel cold. Kitty's name, of course, she remembered, the woman who appeared by Ethan's side during their Cold War years ago, later frequenting his office more often than she did. She had seen the trending post, Ethan and Kitty rumored to wed by year-end, a commercial alliance escalates. He might have done nothing, but he hadn't denied it either. That was Ethan, always leaving others guessing, always causing pain, never truly explaining. She had begun to consider forgiveness, gradually lowering her guard. Yet she lost to his perpetual placement of her outside his explanations. She gave a self-deprecating smile, a single tear falling into the wind. Ethan, you saved me once. But you also destroyed me again. Late at night, Ethan stood beneath Annie's studio for 4 hours straight. She didn't appear. He called, only to find himself blocked. He emailed, only to have it returned. He even sent an assistant with her favorite daisies, which were returned untouched. At that moment, he finally understood she was truly done, her last ounce of patience exhausted. Who's Kitty? He nearly roared at his assistant. Trembling, the assistant replied, Ethan, we only have a professional relationship with her. Her engagement announcement was unilateral hype. Then where did she get the nerve? She posted a collaboration photo of you two on Facebook with the caption "Witness our moment by year's end," and the media spun stories from it. Who authorized her post? No one. We asked her to delete it, but she ignored us, saying, "You won't clarify it anyway." Ethan's anger pulsed through the veins on his hands. Only then did he realize his mistake. It wasn't that he didn't explain, but that he habitually met issues with silence, believing explanations were a sign of weakness or unnecessary proof. He saw it as composure, unaware that in her eyes, this silence inflicted repeated wounds. The day Annie received Kitty's personal admission of misunderstanding, she was on a business trip. She neither cried nor laughed, simply turned off her phone and slept for 3 full hours on the return flight. Upon waking, her first action was to transfer the Paris collaboration contract to the studio's second designer. Her stance was clear: she no longer wanted it. She had once fought desperately to reach that position to prove herself. But once there, she realized that with Ethan still tied to her name, others' gazes would never be pure. She didn't want to be propped up, she wanted respect earned on her own. 3 days later, Ethan appeared at her door, just as she once had it, his neither knocking nor leaving, standing until nightfall. She intended to pretend she wasn't home, but his hoarse, weary voice came through the intercom: "Annie, I was wrong." She stood behind the door, fingertips tense. "I should have told you sooner it was Kitty acting on her own. I gave her no response, nor agreed to any engagement. I thought you'd understand me without needing an explanation. I was too presumptuous. I once hurt you to make you let go, but now I see the one who truly regrets it is me." She closed her eyes, her breath uneven. That I was wrong was something she'd waited 3 years to hear. Yet at this moment, she found she no longer had the strength to forgive. From outside, Ethan's voice struck her heart word by word. "Annie, I won't force you anymore. If you don't want to collaborate, I'll withdraw. If you don't want to see me, I'll leave. If you don't want to return, I won't ask you to. I just want to tell you I love you sincerely." The room remained silent. Her heart felt as though it had been struck hard. She hadn't not imagined what it would feel like to hear those words from his mouth. But she had waited too long, so long that this "I love you" sounded like a belated letter from the past, its warmth long dissipated. The noise outside quieted. She finally approached the peephole and saw that ever-upright man standing in the rain, umbrella-less, water sliding from his temples into his collar. He stood there until dawn. She didn't open the door, but she didn't sleep either. Waking the next morning, she opened the door to find no one there, only a folded note pressed beneath a dried umbrella. She picked up the note, written in his characteristically calm, neat handwriting: "It's fine if you don't forgive me. I'll wait for you forever, even if you never turn back." Looking at those words, her eyes moistened. She knew Ethan never bowed his head, not even before the board. But now, he was so humbled he didn't dare ask to meet. Yet she also knew the wounds he'd inflicted were too deep beyond erasure by a mere "I love you." That night, Annie dreamed of their first trip together. She got lost, standing in the crowd for ages, until he grabbed her hand from behind. She asked, "How did you find me?" He said, "If you don't show up, I won't leave." She had thought it a jest then. Now she realized he truly would wait forever. She sat by the bed, sleepless all night. At dawn's faint light, she stared at her phone screen for a long time. Scrolling down, she saw an unread Instagram message from a familiar profile: "I'm heading to Singapore today for an overseas market project, back next week. If you still don't want to see me, I won't disturb you." She stared at the message for a long while before typing, "Ethan, if I never forgive you in this lifetime, what will you do?" He replied within seconds, "I won't blame you. But I won't give up on you either." She closed her eyes, her nose stinging slightly. Perhaps it wasn't that she no longer loved him, she was simply exhausted. "Ethan, will you wait? Even for a lifetime?" On the 5th day of Ethan's trip, Annie's life seemed to have returned to normal. Everything in the studio was normal, brand cooperation was gradually resumed, and she also received an invitation letter from the Paris Design Association. The day she signed the agreement in a coffee shop, the sunlight was perfect. Yet her heart felt an empty void, as if something remained unresolved. She could deceive others, but not herself. Since he stood in the rain at her door, her heart could no longer treat him as just an ex. That night, back at her apartment, she opened her email to find a message from Ethan, titled simply, "I answer." The body was brief, addressing her earlier question: "If I never forgive you in this lifetime, what will you do?" His response: "Then I'll quietly love you for a lifetime from a place you can't see." Annie stood frozen. She read the email repeatedly, her eyes gradually welling up. Ethan's pride had never been something he voiced. But this time, he laid bare his softest side to her, unmasked, unguarded, unconditional. The day he returned, a light rain fell. He had just landed and hadn't yet reached the company when Annie's call interrupted him. She asked, "Where are you now?" He paused, "Just got off the plane." Then, "Could you come pick me up?" Ethan turned and headed out almost instantly. When he arrived, she stood at the corner by a bookstore entrance, wearing a light camel coat, her hair slightly damp from the rain, holding a bag full of sketches. He approached quickly. She looked up, their eyes meeting. In that moment, there were no more misunderstandings, no more stubbornness, no more hurtful silences between them. A single glance sufficed to convey all the unspoken love. "Didn't you say you didn't want to see me?" he asked softly. She raised her eyes, looking at him earnestly. "I thought I could refuse to forgive you. But later, I realized it's not that I can't let go of you, it's that I can't let go of us." Ethan froze. The next second, she stepped half a pace closer. "Are you still willing to wait for me once more?" His voice was nearly hoarse. "I'd wait for you any length of time." She nodded. "Then let's begin." A month later, they appeared together at the Paris Autumn Fashion Show. She was the invited design mentor, he the partnering group's investor. Media captured him applauding from the audience. That day, she was backstage in designer workwear, sweating from her efforts. He walked in, took the sketches from her hands, and said softly, "I used to think you needed me, but in truth, it's I who have always needed you." She smiled. "If you'd said this earlier, maybe we'd have." "I said it late, but I want to keep saying it from now on, every day." After the fashion show that night, under Paris's sky, he presented the black velvet box he should have offered long ago. She looked at the six-prong ring, tears shimmering in her eyes. He said, "Annie, I missed you once, I won't miss you again. This time, will you marry me?" She didn't speak, only raised her hand, extending her left ring finger. A light rain fell, yet her palm was warm. The wind swept past the Eiffel Tower as she stood before him, her gaze resolute yet tender. She said, "This time, I've waited for you a long time." Annie had once said, "I don't want your protection, I want to stand beside you." And Ethan had finally learned to love not through control, but respect. Not by keeping her at his side, but by accompanying her wherever she wished to go, even if that path didn't include him. Fortunately, this time, neither of them got lost again.